Now, what I want to do is propose a structure for Holocaust denial, and I call it a three-legged stool. First of all, illogic and would be one leg. Willful distortions would be a second leg, and camouflaged discourse would be the third leg. And if you're imagining a little footstool, the seat of the stool, the seat from which it all emanates, is classic anti-Semitism. So I'll come to that at the end. I have to say that when I first heard about Holocaust denial, some of you may have seen my TED Talk, which I gave on this topic, but the first thing I did was I laughed. Who would take these guys seriously? They have no evidence, they have no narrative, they have no witnesses. Who would take them seriously? They seemed to me akin to flat earth theorists or people who are convinced Elvis Presley is alive and well. And I had heard this, and then when I began to work on it, and I was brought to work on it not out of a deep and abiding interest in Holocaust denial. I really also thought it was, for those of you who know Yiddish, Narishkeit, garbage, silly, stupid, whatever. Because two prominent historians of the Holocaust, Yehuda Bauer and Yisrael Gutman, names that might be well known to you if you've done any research or history of the Holocaust, came to me and said, Deborah, we'd like you to study this. And they were coming to me within the context of the Hebrew University's Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism. And I looked at them and I said, you take these guys seriously? And they say, yes, we do, and we think it's important. So if two people of this stature come to you and say, we think something is important, you don't just laugh it off, but I have to say, I still had my doubts. And one of the reasons even with these doubts, that I nonetheless did it, because Holocaust deniers' arguments just seemed too absurd to be taken seriously, was my assumption that this would be a momentary matter. I would do, I had just finished one book, I hadn't yet turned to another topic. Someone hands you a topic, a little bit of a rant, never hurts, especially when you're at the beginning of your career. And I said, okay, so I'll spend 2-3 years working on this, I'll learn something, and then on to other things. So I was wrong on a number of accounts. First of all, as you well know, and you know from Charles's introduction, this would be far more than a momentary plunge. It would constitute the better part of my academic career and involve me in a 6-7 year long legal battle. And secondly, denial was worth taking seriously. Not panicking about, not thinking that, everyone's going to become a denier. The fact is that there are far more people who never heard of the Holocaust than who deny its existence. So, just get this out of the way before I trip on it. But still, it is something to be taken seriously. And finally, it is, as I've said before, and I'll repeat again, a classic form of anti-Semitism. So what do I mean by a three-legged stool? A lack of logic. The arguments are illogical. They are the same kind of illogic, and you heard this yesterday from Professor Patterson and other people, I'm sure, that are endemic to a conspiracy theory. It's exactly what you'd expect from a conspiracy theory, and conspiracy theories by nature are illogical. There is willful distortion and invention of evidence. And when I say willful distortion, it also means ignoring evidence that is all conclusive. So either you distort what exists, you ignore it, or you invent. Also things endemic to conspiracy theories. Those of you who heard the talk yesterday, mentioned the talk yesterday in discussion of the protocols, both in the yesterday afternoon's talk and in the show we heard last night. And again, to go back to my point earlier, but to reiterate, there is a modus operandi that conveniently disguises extremism, disguises prejudice and racism in the form of rational discourse. And when I first began to write on this and to think about it, Holocaust denial was one of my few examples, though you also saw it in terms, certainly in the United States, of racism. Arguments made by seeming scholars who would say that the black person is genetically inferior, or would be making overtly racist arguments, posing overtly racist arguments, but not sitting there in a Ku Klux Klan robe or a hood, but sitting there in a academic garb and sounding and publishing books with lots of footnotes, sounding like they were making a rational argument. So what do I mean? Let's start with the first leg, denial of logic. The Holocaust has the dubious distinction of being the best documented genocide in the world. The Armenian genocide is fairly well documented. Of course, we don't have all the documents from the Armenian genocide because the Turkish government prevents that from happening and prevents them from being released. But certainly the Holocaust has this distinction of 20th century genocide and being conducted by a state with the state apparatus. The documentation is immense. So what do deniers say? Deniers, of course, will say, well, those documents were planted, were forged by Jews with the collusion of the Allies and the Soviets after the war. Now, of course, they were found immediately after the war, so this collusion must have been going on, from the denier's perspective, all through the war. But forging a document is not simple. I mean, in other words, you can't forge a pile of documents and then say, okay, as soon as the war is over, we're going to go and plant all these documents. Because, first of all, if you've ever worked in German World War II, or even not World War II era archives, or diplomatic archives of any kind, but certainly the German World War II era documents, they have a very complex filing system and classification system. So you can't suddenly stick something in the middle where it doesn't belong, where it doesn't follow in sequence. More importantly, you can't stick it in there on a typewriter, which is what would have been used, whose font doesn't match the documents that came before and the documents that came after. Now, you could say someone changed typewriters, but if all these documents are suddenly, of a different font, that calls into question. The other thing, of course, that would have to be, and when I say this to my students, I have to explain it to them because they don't know what it is. And some of you in this audience may be young enough also not to know what it is. But the typewriter ribbon had to be of the same strength, the arguments of the documents type before a type after. When they look at typewriter ribbon, what is that? I say printer cartridge. Oh, then they get it. So, in other words, you can't just stick something in the middle. Copies of the original document that were sent to someone must be replicated by copies in the sender's files. You can't just, again, if you're planting military government documents, you can't just plant them around or say, oh, look, I found this here, independent of anything else. The paper used must be of the wartime era. So all these things on a technological basis, forensic basis, immediately raise questions about, oh, this is a forged document. By the way, the same thing can be said of wartime diaries. Now, one of the things that deniers are most prone to go after and try to prove as a forgery is Anne Frank's diary. You might think, why do they spend all this effort on Anne Frank's diary? They spend all this effort on Anne Frank's diary because for many young people, it is their first introduction to the Holocaust. So if we can pull out the foundation stone, which made you think that the Holocaust is real, then they hope they can collapse everything else. So what will they argue? They'll argue, oh, Anne Frank's diary was written in green ballpoint pen. And, a green ballpoint pen didn't exist till after the war, didn't come into use till after the war. There are one or two, I'm not sure, I don't remember, it's 1, 2, or 3 notations in the margin. There are a few, so let's just say a few notations in the margin by editors who never dreamt that they would be writing on the original manuscript of something that would become so exceptionally valuable. But they made notations about editing, about publication, etc. But I've seen the diary itself. It's not, I can assure you, it's not in green ballpoint pen. And better than me, the Dutch wartime, the archives to which this diary has been given by the Frank family, by Otto Frank, was so distressed by the attacks on the diary that I believe was in the early 90s. They published this massive book. Some of you may have seen it, Anne Frank, the Critical Edition. It has, first of all, her original version of the diary, rewritten version of the diary, because she rewrites it for publication. And by the way, parenthetically, Philip Roth, the late Philip Roth, in looking at those two forms, said she would have been a great writer because at age 15, she knew how to edit herself. In any case, and it has the fictional thing. So it's set up, you can see how each one is a little different. But there are also essays, and essays by forensic specialists who studied the ink, who studied the glue of the diary, who studied the paper, and who also studied, we have lots of examples of Anna's handwriting, because in her school before, with her friends, she signed what we used to call autograph books. She sent postcards to friends, not of course from the annex, but before. So the forensic specialist can look at a handwriting and say, this is how a handwriting will change from when someone is 11, someone is 13, someone is 15 or 16, and all those things match. But it's not only the quality of the documents that throws question or throws the denier's claims into doubt. It makes it illogical. For deniers to be right, who would have to be wrong? Certainly survivors. Now, some deniers will say, well, this survivor says, you know, I got off the train and I walked 10 feet to where Mengele was standing, and this survivor says, I got off the train and we had to walk a half a mile to where Mengele was standing. Well, if you're talking, let's say, about the Hungarian deportations, when the trains were already coming into Birkenau, and I assume that some of you have visited Birkenau, for the Hungarian deportations, you know, the iconic picture, the iconic gate with the train going through, that's when that train spur was added to facilitate the quick destruction of Hungarian Jewry. There were a lot of Jews to be killed in a relatively short time, so they pulled the train in there. That train ran the length, again, if you've been to Birkenau, you've seen pictures, you know the train runs the length of the camp. So some survivors say, I was reported from Budapest on this particular day, we got off the train and we turned to, and we arrived at this place, we were pulled off the cars and we had to line up and walk to our right, where the doctors were standing. It's not, everyone says Mengele, it's not always Mengele, there were other doctors as well, but he has sort of become euphemistic or iconic for all the doctors. And some people say we got off the train and we walked to our left. Well, it depended, the doctor stood in the middle. So if you got on the train at the end or you got on the train in the beginning, it depends what direction you went to. So there are all kinds of discrepancies which can be explained logically, but were every denier to give you a survivor, but because the deniers hone in on every little, oh, she said that, and she said this, she said there were 20 people in the room, and she said there were 40 people in the car, 20 in the car, 40 in the car. Were every person to give you the exact same description with no discrepancies, that should raise suspicions. If, God forbid, suddenly there was a fire alarm, false alarm, but let's say, and we had to run out of here quickly. And it turns out that some sociology class is doing a little experiment. And when they get us outside, they separate each one of us and they say, how many people were in the room? How many rows were in the room? What color were the chairs? Well, that's easy to remember. But, you know, how many tiers up were there? All sorts of things, which if you're sitting and looking around, someone's asking you, you look around and you see. But if there's a trauma, you suddenly have to race out. You're not going to, if everybody said, oh, there were 12 rows and there were 82 people in the room and the first row had 15 seats and the last row, as it got narrower, the last row had X number of seats, then you get suspicious. Especially if you're talking about a traumatic moment. And I can think of no more traumatic moment than people being unloaded from a boxcar after having, or a train after having traveled without water, without facilities, into an unknown area. And of course, the arrivals were at night. By and large, all arrivals were at night. And they were conducted yelling, screaming, get off, get off, get off, get off, line up, pushing people, because it dislocated people. We assumed that that was the reason. It dislocated people and it made you more pliable when you don't know exactly what's going on. So certainly, if everyone had the exact information, what day we arrived, what time we arrived, how long it took, I would be more skeptical than with discordant notes. Now, you may think it's absurd for anyone to think that people would have this exact information, but in the Auschwitz-Birkenau trial, the Auschwitz-Frankfurt trials, which took place after the Eichmann trial, sort of the Eichmann trial, they had been in preparation, but they sort of embarrassed Germany to get them organized and conducted a little faster. Defense attorneys asked survivors, what time did this happen? What day did this happen? Now, survivors had neither calendars, inmates in the camps had neither calendars nor wristwatches. But if they couldn't answer that, time, date, precise location, they were attacked by the defense attorneys as not being worthy witnesses. So it's not such an absurd thing when, that kind of thing will be used against the survivor, not just by deniers, but by these defense attorneys. But who else would have to be wrong other than survivors? Bystanders. The people who lived, whether it's the town of Auschwitz, or the village of Treblinka, or in Lublin, or in many, many other places, talking about the death camps or talking about the shooting spaces, Einsatzgruppen, people who live near the places or on the road or just in the towns and in the villages where Jews were marched out into ditches that had been dug and were shot. And those people many of them have acknowledged, yes, we saw this. In Shoah, Lanzmann has interviews with the people from the town of Treblinka and saying we knew what was going on there. That's not to say there was anything they could have done about it. You can make a brief against what some Polish people did and did not do. But on that grounds, I don't think there's much that can be argued. Just a parenthetical observation. But they saw the trains going in day after day filled with people coming out empty. Father Patrick Deborah has gotten a lot of, a French Catholic priest, has gotten testimony from many of the people in Belarus and in other parts of Eastern Europe about saying, oh, there's a grave, there's a site over there of a grave of 200 bodies. There's a site of grave over there. They were kids then. One of the reasons they often give this information is to Father Deborah. Comes with his collar, and the local priest says, you can talk to him. He's a man of God. So, and people want to sort of confess that they know this prior to their demise. But it's not just survivors and bystanders. Historians, scholars, thousands of scholars in Israel, in North and South America, in Australia, in Asia, in every part of the world who have worked on different aspects of this, would all have to have been duped or in on the hoax and not talked about it. So again, that beggars the imagination in terms of, wait a minute, that just doesn't make sense. That you would get these thousands of people to take part in, to write articles, to do research, to find documents, and they're all on the hoax, and they've all either been duped, tricked, or they're in on it and haven't spoken about it. But finally, the most important way of answering deniers' claims is the perpetrators. The perpetrators. In not one war crimes trial after World War II did a perpetrator say it didn't happen. They said, I didn't do it. I was just following orders. I had no choice. But not, it didn't happen. And that is, of course, quite striking. And we even have written evidence. This was released by the Israeli government for my trial. In the lull or the gap between the end of testimony and the decision of the High Court in Israel about Eichmann's fate, he wrote a memoir while he was in prison. And after he died, the Israeli government had it, and they decided to just bury it in the archives because, according to what I was told, Prime Minister Ben-Gurion said this man had months on the stand to make his, give his lies and to lie about what he did. We're not responsible for publishing it, etc. But over the years, in the 90s, the children of the Eichmann family tried to get the diary. Maybe they thought they could sell it, whatever it was. And there was a big debate in Israel about what should be done. Should they release it? Should they release it in an annotated fashion? There was all sorts of discussions, and the government brought together leading historians to talk about this. And in what has become endemic to the Middle East, in all its aspects, nothing happened. So the diary sat there. But during my trial, one of my students, in fact, said, why don't you try to get the diary? And though we didn't really need it as evidence, I thought, well, this would be a good way of trying to get it released, and the Israeli government did agree to release it, and they released it. And in that diary, or in that memoir, that period that he writes from, I think it's about August till about December, maybe it's a little earlier than August, he repeatedly makes reference to gassings. And on top of that, remember, Eichmann is this, I would say, not the CEO, but the management, one of the chief managers, COO, not the chief. It wasn't the Holocaust was not his idea, his invention, but he's one of the chief operating officers. Certainly, as it comes to Western Europe, certainly it comes to Greek Jewry, and certainly as it comes to Hungarian Jewry. And when he was in Argentina, when he was enabled to escape to Argentina, while he was there were a group of German expats, many of them faithful Nazis. He gave talks to them. And in the talks, they were taped because the man who arranged it thought, well, maybe he could eventually sell these as a book, make some money with Eichmann, etc. In those tapes, there were repeated references to the mass murder of the Jews, to gas, etc. The expats sitting there said, oh, no, this can't be true. They were out of Germany. They were loyal Nazis. They created Nazi schools, et cetera, in Argentina. But when they heard Eichmann tell, they said, oh, he must be making this up. And people said, he's making it up, But on some level, there is birth some of denial. There's a very good book on this by Bettina Stangneth called Eichmann Before Jerusalem, Eichmann for Jerusalem. The notion that the Germans would admit to a genocide of these unprecedented proportions and would impose on their nation and subsequent generations, here we are over 7 decades since the end, a horrific legacy that would become part of its national identity, beggars the imagination. If you go to the left, the progressive left, such as the people depicted that we saw yesterday in the Labor Party, not all of them, but certainly those we saw depicted, their view of prejudice is, again, using the prism analogy, is refracted through a prism that has 3 facets: ethnicity, class, and power. They look at Jews and they see people who, if not white, they can pass as white. Though there are lots of Jews of color. I've just come from Israel, where over 50% of the population of Israel would be considered people of color. And some of them, you don't even have to, Ethiopians, you don't even have to put the quotation marks around. But certainly Mizrahi Jews and other Jews. But from their perspective, the Jews have the choice of how to depict themselves, and they are wealthy. Ipso facto, from that perspective of prejudice, they have power. If you have power, you can't be a victim of prejudice. It's impossible for you to be a victim of prejudice. Therefore, what are you talking about? A conference on anti-Semitism? Give me a break. And then you add another element, which we heard from Corbyn last night in the Panorama show. Me? You know, to quote that great American philosopher and observer of human nature, Miss Piggy, moi? Moi? Me? Prejudice? I have been a lifelong fighter against prejudice, any form of prejudice. My mother demonstrated at Cable Street. That was the anti-fascist demonstrations in the 30s in London. You're accusing me? So it's oxymoronic for you to claim to be a victim. It's oxymoronic for you to accuse me of being a perpetrator. So the two, you know, it doesn't work. So
for the Jewish community, or for any community, I think if you have power, you can define who you are. When you're limited in power, people define who you are. So on the one hand, Jews were killed for not being white, and now in the United States in particular, Jews are being perceived as white, and I think Jewish people are internalizing their whiteness at an interesting level. In Canada, Jews were never really white, and they're still not white, even though we're, you know, the Jewish population of Canada and the United States are similar, but white identity is different. So as the Jews become more assimilated and perhaps distant from their culture and understanding who we are as a people and how we identify as a people, they're assuming maybe more of an American identity, which is highly racialized. And what's also interesting, I think, in the United States, there's sort of this gap emerging for all sorts of reasons between American Jewish identity and Israeli national identity and other Jewish diaspora communities. How is American racism, or the social construction of the American kind of racial formation, and Omi and Wynot talks about, how is that impacting on Jewish identity in the United States, and how that is maybe impacting on
oh my
Israel
God, that's a whole conference you
Okay.
just designed there. I'm just going to take a stab at certain aspects of it. I think there are a lot of Jews in the United States, and not just in the United States, in the UK too. There's been a number of articles in today's Jewish Chronicle about, who is it, Hopkins, Katie Hopkins, is that her name? Who is a flaming racist and a flaming anti-Muslim, and has talked about, I don't know if she's talked about immigrants or she's talked about Muslims as cockroaches. And that's a Nazi-like depiction, you know. In Eternal Jew, at one point, there's a famous scene where they pick up a bag of flour or some sort of rice, whatever it is, and the rats come out, and that's used to depict the Jews, you know. And there are some Jews who are not, I wouldn't say lots of Jews and many Jews, but she's been speaking in some Jewish gatherings, homes, small organizations, etc. Because the assumption is, well, she's anti-Muslim and we're under attack by Muslims. And what the article is saying is, first of all, you shouldn't be doing this just in and of itself. And second of all, if you don't think that after she's finished with the Muslims, she's not going to turn on you, or she's creating an atmosphere, a world in which prejudice and hatred is so acceptable. But I think there are Jews, not a lot, not a majority, certainly not the organizational structure, but there are some Jews who have sort of hunkered down and looked for allies in all the wrong places. I think that's, you know,
Okay.
go ahead.
No, okay, thank you. So now going back to the academic stuff and denial. So you speak about a certain type of Holocaust denial. So we were discussing in the conference the rise of sort of the extreme left, the extreme right, and political Islam's anti-Semitism and the attack on the democratic center. Going into the academic world, I would argue, and other scholars have argued, there's a more sophisticated type of revisionism. So people like, in my view, Timothy Schneider's book on the Bloodlands. So he's not a Holocaust revisionist.
Not at all.
But he's saying, in a way, the Holocaust happened, it's horrible. But something similar happened over there, and it's sort of like a geographical, I would argue, a geographical argument that's sort of revisionist. It sort of equalizes.
Though he does say in Bloodlands, after I challenged him exactly as you did, and he made me go back and look at the section in Bloodlands, where he says what Stalin did was horrific. And anybody who doesn't have an idea of what Stalin did, particularly to the Ukrainian population, he made them eat the seed corn. What does that mean? He guaranteed that the following year there would be starvation. They don't have food to eat, let them use the seed corn that you set aside so that you'll have something to plant for the following year. I mean, it wasn't done on, I want to wipe out a certain ethnic group. It was done that these were the peasants and get rid of them. I think, Timothy, I don't want to get into the weeds about a particular book because many people haven't read it.
So I'll say academic revision.
Yes,
is that a threat?
I think what we're having in the academy in certain cases is somewhat of a, I call this is a little bit glib, and I know I'm being taped, so don't take this too seriously, a McCarthyism of the left, where what is acceptable and what is not acceptable to be said, or students at good schools, along with faculty at good schools, saying, well, we're not going to allow certain things to be said because it makes some students feel uncomfortable. I find that very dangerous. Now, I'm not saying that we should be inviting people on campus to make students feel uncomfortable. I don't think David Duke should be invited, and I don't think David Irving should be invited. But we know how the campus works, and there are many people here associated with campuses, that it's that anomaly where, the president can't control who gets invited. People get invited by groups, and if they're legitimate groups, you can, in most cases, invite them. But there are those who are arguing we shouldn't allow people to come on who make us feel uncomfortable. Now, I'm not arguing for, giving David Duke a platform, and I think if he came, I would be out there protesting, et cetera. But sometimes we have to, you can't do that because it gets very dangerous. The minute you start saying who can come and who can't come. Like there's certain people, some people that are working BDS, some people are saying we shouldn't allow people who support, well, if you're going to do that, you're going to end up with the other end as well. So I think you're right in that certainly within the Jewish community, there's a lot of short-sighted thinking going on that can be very troublesome. But I do think American Jews have been completely, again, to borrow the British term, gobsmacked by what happened because they didn't really expect this at all.
So you mentioned a little in the first half of your lecture about Netanyahu's cooperation with certain right-wing governments, and especially like Hungary's or the Polish law, and also like he also does not have a great history about talking historically accurate things about the Holocaust.
One would say that.
And like when in 2015 he said it was the
Mufti who convinced Hitler when,
to
right, which is ridiculous, right.
And, so I was wondering what are the implications of this sort of...
I just get, of Netanyahu, okay, I'm only cutting you because I see a lot of anxious people around you, and I know, I stand between you and lunch, and you may like my talking very much, but you like lunch better. I just gave an interview last week to the Times of Israel, which appeared on Monday. And when I posted it, I said, do never give an interview when you're over-caffeinated and underslept, because the filters come down and you speak the truth. I've gotten a very good response, and then some people who want to, I don't know, string me up or not, or maybe less than that, but who are not happy. I am very, and I at one point I briefed, when I was in Israel, I briefed the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and I said the same thing to them, so I'm not, I am very troubled. Let me back up. I understand realpolitik. I understand that nothing I say will determine whether, there's peace or not peace, whether a population is safe or not safe. I say it, I can say things here, then we go to lunch and you can all forget what I said. Head of government has a different responsibility. Having said that, I am very disturbed by Prime Minister Netanyahu's outreach to the Poles in terms of their rewriting of the history, outreach to Orban, engaging in overt anti-Semitism, a great fighter against anti-Semitism. Where was he last week? He was in Lithuania. He was, and his comments there. If those are being done for realpolitik reasons, that these are people who will vote in the EU more in Israel's favor, where some of the Western democracies are automatically against it, I understand that. But then don't claim for yourself the mantle of the country that's going to fight on behalf of Jews who who are subjected to anti-Semitism anywhere in the world. You can't have it both ways. Back here, yes.
I'm going to defer to Richard.
Okay, Richard.
Well, let me defer to Mark and then add my question, which is, you know, there's.
What's wrong here?
Right.
Go ahead.
There's a fair number of people who say Islamophobia is the new anti-Semitism. So I just want you to comment on that, but.
Okay, Mark.
Yeah, I'm a scientist, but I'm a faith in the Church of England.
You're a scientist?
Yeah, but I'm in the Church of England, so. And I see the Church in England as a source of anti-Semitism, without doubt, in England. The Church in England.
Can you speak up, please?
The Church in England.
I'll repeat it.
The blood libel, the idea that Jewish children were tortured and crucified, and the blood was used in
In preparation of matzah.
loaf bread. And that libel now has been spread around the world, and it's preached regularly in the Arab world, in Saudi Arabia, and also in Turkey, and Rad Salah preaches it, Jeremy Corbyn's friend. And so, can we make the church in England, or Church of England, take responsibility for this blood libel, as you say, words are what
Words
cause
can.
it.
Okay, let me.
Could we even take a class action against the church just to make a point?
Because I was sued, I'm not a lawyer, so I can't tell you what you can do. And the second question, Mark's question was about the blood libel emanating from the Church of England, because the blood libel started in this parts of the world. You're at Norwich, in this part of the world, where the myth that Jews use the blood of a young Christian child and whom they capture and kill, particularly right before Passover, to prepare the leavened bread, the matzah. Now, what is that? That is a reenactment of the crucifixion. When was Jesus killed? And it's Passover time. That's why Passover and Easter always come out close together. I don't think. I think at the very least you could ask you could hope that one day the Church of England will take moral responsibility for it. The damage is still the damage. Once you let something out of the bag, there's no easily putting it back. Whether it's anti-Semitism, whether it's racism, whether it's homophobia, it's very hard to put this back. That's one of the reasons why I worry so much about my country, because so much of these emotions that have come out of the bag. Let me turn to Islamophobia and then take one last question. I don't like the term Islamophobia. I don't think it's the new anti-Semitism. Let me back up from it. I think the young person or the older person, or any person wearing a kippah should feel as safe walking in the street as the young woman wearing a hijab, as the young African American walking with a couple of friends from the park wearing a hoodie should not be subjected to persecution or attack or profiling by anyone, and particularly people entrusted with the authority to maintain order. I'm against all of those kind of things. They bother me deeply, and don't think that the person who beats up the kid in Berlin, as has happened so often, with wearing kippot, etc., is going to stop on someone else. But having said that, so I am against discrimination of any kind and attacks of any kind on Muslims, as I am against Jews, etc. I don't like the term Islamophobia because I think that there have been certain actions in the world, and I want to say this very carefully, and actually I'm saying it with no time left, and it's a major can of worms that I'm opening. But I certainly don't want to engage in the prejudice that we're here to meet about and talk about and expose. But there are reasons to have a fear of some of the things that are being preached in the name of Islam, whether they're truly Islam or not, whether coming from imams or coming from others. We see that in certain countries. So I think that there is a legitimate right to be concerned about the Islamist extremism is how I call it. I don't call it Muslim extremism because I don't want, or Islam extremism because it's not necessarily the religion, but it's the way the religion is being used. But having said that, I think that to describe it as the new anti-Semitism is to way overstate the historical roots of it, way overstate the ancient quality of it, way overstate the way it has shaped the face of the Jewish community, and to some degree I find that a disparaging of anti-Semitism. Final question, yes.
So, my name's Robin and I'm Jamaican. So, I'd like to pick up on your last point as well as yours. There seems to be a recurring question about the role that Christianity had in forming anti-Semitism. It wasn't until the 3rd century that the rise of the Roman Emperor, like Tertullian, when early Christianity departed from Judaic roots like Shema and started embracing more Platonic ideas.
That's right.
That later writers like St. Augustine or the prominent others that Professor Patterson mentioned yesterday. It wasn't until that time when it started embracing these Platonic doctrines that these writers started maligning Judaic roots. And it was in that malignment of Judaic roots that bred to modern anti-Semitism, to the point where, to mention the Church of England, I think the Roman Catholic Church especially, with Tertullian when he started mingling with Christianity in the 3rd century, the Roman Catholic Church, of which Tertullian was the de facto head when it started, to this day adopts every church as its daughter churches, save one, which is, de facto Messianic Judaism, because they held to the roots that they were not going to embrace these Platonic beliefs that led to anti-Semitism. So it's especially if you want further clarity, you can read writers like, as he mentioned yesterday, writers who believe more or align more with premillennialism and are therefore more aligned with Israel, supporting Israel. These Christians don't necessarily support anti-Semitism, but they're more definitely aligned with see Israel as the roots, or to those to whom the oracles of God were, given, and are more embracing of these,
Yeah, I'm not sure what your question is, but I'm going to
It was a comment.
A comment, okay. I appreciate your comment, and I did not want to suggest that the New Testament is inherently anti-Semitic. I think the question is, what was done with it over centuries? And sometimes, it's hard to make the differentiation because it's gotten so in the weeds and so in the roots and so in the culture. But the last thing, I don't think anyone who has, to say that someone who is raised on the New Testament is ipso facto going to be an anti-Semite. I do think there were serious problems, talking about the Roman Catholic Church. Not until Vatican II do you have acknowledgement that the Jew of today is not responsible for what the church believes happened, 2,100 years before, 2,000 years before. So there have been real problems with how it has been. But in terms of whether that is the essence of the church, or I'm not saying that at all. So with that, I'm going to end because no one should ever stand between you and lunch. So.
Thank you.